how you got to be careful of not being deceived, because in our culture today, deception is wicked out there, and there is a lot of bad deception being taught, even in the Christian context, about this subject. And I started to, at one time, I thought, well, I'll just list out everybody that's teaching it badly. And I thought, no, I want to give you principles so that you can listen to anybody, any pastor, any teacher, anybody on television or an author, and you can start to decide yourself with those principles if you think you're being deceived or not.
Welcome to the Servant Leaders Mindset Podcast, where we cultivate courageous servant leaders for faith, culture, and public life. Up next. Hey, everyone. Welcome to the show. I'm Dr. Lena Holmes, and this is the Servant Leaders Mindset. If you've been listening to this show for any length of time, you will have often heard me say that leadership development begins with leading yourself. Well, today's guest is going to talk about leadership from the standpoint of stewarding the resources you already have been given. Larry Onan is a graduate of the University of Colorado. He and his wife, Pat, served as full-time staff for Campus Crusade for Christ for 18 years. Later in his career, Larry joined the Management Development Associates team as Vice President of Stewardship Strategies and invested 30 years providing fundraising counsel to Christian ministries. He continues to speak in the United States and abroad. Larry also recently wrote a book titled Intentional Living and Giving. Welcome to the show, Larry.
Well, it's so good to be with you today, Dr. Holmes.
Well, first, I'd like to start by asking you about your perspective on managing resources. Although many that listen to the show are Christians, how would you explain your concept of stewardship to those who are unchurched?
You know, I think leadership is a skill developed. I don't know if it's a talent. In my particular case, I did not know I had any leadership skills. Nobody had ever sat down and talked to me that way. I didn't even know there was a business school until I was at the University of Colorado, and my roommate for a semester was going to the business school working on his master's. And I said, what do you do in a master's in business? Well, I learned later there was a lot there that I needed to learn. At that time, I was majoring in theater arts, and I knew I would end up in New York or Hollywood. So I was unattached to what would be now often called as business side. And later I became good friends of a couple of people that were working on their masters at Harvard in their business school. And I started to realize that the business side and leadership side is the way you manage people and manage projects and manage outcomes. But when I started out, I was a wing and a prayer. I was a one-man band, really. I didn't really know I was doing management. I just was given an assignment, and they said, good luck. Here's the parameters. Here's what you got to do. And I started doing it. And I think many people in life today are learning as they go more than they are getting clinical or advanced degrees in something. And sometimes your failures stare you in the face. Early on, I got a project from my guy that I was working with, and I came to him. I said, there's just no way we can do this. I said, this is impossible. And it was a huge thing. We might come back to that. But his response was, Larry, no one else has ever done what you're doing. So you got the freedom to always fail. And failure is not bad news. Failure is just what you do by learning the ropes of day-to-day living. And if you realize that failure is only going to make you better, then you're not afraid of failing. I think a lot of people are afraid the term says, I'm going to get fired, I'm going to get stopped, I'm going to have something bad happen to me. And in my experience, it was learning by doing and then listening to others. There was some times I've been privileged to take, special courses in management and leadership. That was helpful, but it really was more to enhance what I was learning to do. It wasn't about starting to step into a whole new world. I think a lot of us are managing and leading and don't even know it today. And sometimes you can be kind of a mess at it because you don't know what you're doing and there's implications to things. But I'm one that believes that you learn by doing far more than you learn by the book.
Yeah, you learn as you go.
Right.
Yeah, for sure. And then you learn from other people's mistakes as well. So why is it important to give?
Why it's important to give? Well, first of all, we're created in an image of God Himself, and God is a giver. Probably the most famous verse in all the Bible is a verse in John 3:16 that says, God so loved the world that He gave. So His motivation of love was an action that He took that was in giving. So if I wake up every morning and I do this on a regular basis, somebody told me a few years back, before you get out of bed, Larry, move your ankles and move your feet a little bit because if you don't, you can stumble over them. So I thought, okay, I'll set up, I'll stretch my feet, I'll move my ankles. And then as I'm sitting there, I'm thinking, okay, what is there today for me to do that you've uniquely designed in my assignment? And I want to do what you've led me to do. So that means I'm giving myself away to other people. And it's ironic. And a few weeks ago, I made about a 2 week trip into the southeastern United States. And one of the things I did is meet people that I'd mentored over 50 years. And they were coming back to those experiences. We're still really good friends. I haven't seen them in a long time, but it was amazing when we got together. We were almost exactly where we were when we left off
Mm,
because they were connected to the principles and they would say, well, you taught me or you showed me or your example was.
mhm.
So it was because I was giving myself to them that they were able to pick up principles and they still want to pick up principles. A part of the conversation was help me through this one. What would you do in this case? So I think if we have a mindset that rather than I'm out to take today, what can I get? But we need to in our mindset say today I'm going to be giving to the lives of other people. It could be as a grocery store attendant that needs encouragement, or it could be a high level conversation you'll have with a person that could make significant differences in where you're going to go and where they're going to go. But the mindset is I'm here to give myself away. I'm not
Mhm.
here to take from the culture. I've got to take the initiative. If we are not taking initiative, and I titled the book Intentional Living and Giving, and the word intentional is very important to this whole process. I think a good leader is intentionally helping other people succeed around him. And if
Mhm.
that happens and they are successful in taking that initiative, they're going to benefit and the people that they've helped along the way are going to be benefactors forever. And they'll come back 50 years later saying, I still remember what you did, XYZ. And I'm thinking, I did that. But it was the spirit of giving that was the motivational behind it. It wasn't, and it's not just, I think people sometimes they think if I'm in fund development consulting, I must be liking money. Well, money is a sample of one of 100 things that we can give. So money is really a tool that teaches us things. It's amazing that when we're dealing with giving, we start to learn how to put our priorities in order. And if we're taking, it's all about me. If we're giving, it's about how do I help somebody else.
Right. So that's a good segue into the next question. You list in your book a series of things that or motivations for giving. So, which both could include giving to churches or perhaps giving to other kinds of organizations. Can you talk about a few of those? What are the major motivations for giving?
Well, I think people are strange. I think sometimes they give for self-assurance. I had one story. I was talking to a guy that funded a very major film that's very famous today. It's around the world. It's probably the most translated film in all film history. It's called the Jesus film.
Mm,
And I was talking to the guy that was the major funder of that. This is a number of years ago. And I said, tell me what motivated you and your wife to give to make this film a reality. This is when Warner Brothers was actually producing the film. It was being filmed in the Middle East, and it was a production that later became very famous for its translations. But initially, it was how do we fund a film? And I thought I'd get some high level response. And he looked at me for a minute and he said, the reason we gave that money, and we're talking about close to $6, $7 million, he says, is that I wanted to create a safer place for my kids to live.
mm,
It had nothing to do about a film. It was in creating an environment where the message of Jesus was important to the world. And he wanted a safer place for his grandchildren to live. I thought that was such an interesting response because a lot of times we think there's another reason. They're trying to manipulate or they're trying to get their way. You know, you go to the typical university campus and you'll see buildings named after people.
Yes.
And some of those buildings are done with motivation of the condition of the gift. I was at one major university about 3 weeks ago, and I went to one building. It was a biology building at the university, and it had my friend's father's name on the building. And she said, no, it wasn't because he gave the money. It was because he was so respected for his work in biology and what he did for the university. This was back in the days before they had conditions on the gifts. But many times you'll go on a campus and you'll see a name on it, and it was because they gave the largest gift to make that building possible. The motivation became self serving. I think that genuine giving is not really self serving, although that may be a caveat. That may be something you can add value to it. You know, as a result of your gift, we'd like to name a building for you. But it's interesting that many times people that give those kind of gifts give it on the conditions that you will make this name of this building my family. Well, that's a little bit. So I think sometimes we think that a person is going to give because they see a need. In fact, it's very interesting. People don't like to give to administration. You know, in my
Right.
nonprofit
Absolutely.
world, and so I say you never want to call your appeal, administrative costs. You know, air conditioning and plumbing and upkeep of a building are not what motivate people. The outcome of what that does is what people are interested in. So I think you've got
Right.
to look at giving as a what is it that motivates me? First of all, I often will not give unless I'm asked. It's one of the
Hmm.
key principles behind my whole thinking is that not only is God a giver, he wants me to learn how to ask. Some time ago, I was speaking for a men's breakfast here in my local area. And at the end of that particular gathering, all the guys got up and left two people to clean up the room and bus tables and do things that needed to be done. And I was picking up from the few things I had. And I thought, you know, all they would have had to say at the end of the meeting, before you leave today, could you bust the tables? Could you do something to help us get this room back in shape? And within 5 minutes, we can flip this to another meeting usage. Everybody left, and two people were saying, probably in their minds, I wish they'd have stayed around and helped. Know why they didn't stay around and helped? They
Because
weren't
they didn't ask. Right.
they were
Right.
not asked. So
Right.
I think there's an important thing is if you ask somebody, it gives you the chance to let them process what your opportunity for giving is. So I believe that there's a motivation that sometimes comes from a I really feel I've got to do it, but there's also motivation I've been asked, I've been clearly presented a need, and I've been invited to partner. And when a person takes the initiative to help me do that, my response is a lot higher. In fact, I've got to think twice about saying no. I sometimes will say, I'm going to say no to this one. But when they ask me so well, what do? I help them out.
Well, part of it too is that because I was a dean for advancement, so in higher ed, so a lot of it too is teasing out what do people care about. I have
Right.
situations where one guy gave us $1 million to upgrade some technology, and then he left us 3 million when he did pass away. But all of this was that he wanted to see the school advance their technology. And then there another situation where another woman started out with like a $1 million scholarship, and then later on, when she passed away, she gave more money because she was mostly the most important thing to her was leaving a legacy for her son who went to the school. She didn't go to the school. So people have so many different reasons. The key, what a good fundraiser would do, or one that has, takes a little experience, and that is to figure out what do they care about. And
Well,
many
you're
times, as you said, it's not about themselves. It's more about leaving a legacy in
And
many
there's some people
situations.
that are not everybody wants to give to everything, and not one shoe fits everybody. So you've got to really
Absolutely.
be careful. In the fund development arena, it's a work of relationships. It's not a work about money. It's a work about relationships and listening and responding to their need.
Absolutely. So this is, many people, they believe that giving to churches. Now let's talk about church.
Okay.
They believe that it's a waste of time because leaders in churches sometimes are not good stewards of the money that is given. So the question is, and you talk a lot about this in your book. I like a lot of what you said, but in terms of stewarding money or giving money to churches, what do you have to say to those people who don't trust the leadership or to steward the money properly?
Well, first of all, I think, and that's the key word, is that the person that's looking to give is a steward of something that's been entrusted to him. And I think that the church has got to look back and say, okay, this is not, we're not just manipulating people to give money. We're helping them learn a lesson in the process of being stewards. So I look at everybody in a congregation as a steward that's sitting there ready to be taught something along this line. I think it's really sad today when church pastors and leaders do not teach biblical giving to their own people. They almost treat it as, okay, this is our fundraising Sunday or fundraising push, and we've got to talk about this terrible thing called money, rather than I'm talking to stewards and you've got something that's been entrusted to you. Let me help you be effective. Now, I think the organization has got to be very clear. It's got to be very transparent. I think there's a lot of learning curve in the church about people really want to know where their money's going, and they should know that. That makes them good stewards. And so I think sometimes the lack of resources in a church building, is because their lack of clarity on leadership about what is happening, what the mission is, what the outcome is going to be. It's interesting that churches will struggle with their operational costs, but they will not struggle raising money for going to camp for students,
Mm.
because the person that's giving there is saying, "I'm helping this little 10-year-old spend 5 days in the mountains, and in that time, his life could be changed." In my culture where I live in a very urban part of Southern California. We are taking a group of probably 15 or 20 kids in a couple of weeks to camp, and probably half of those kids have never been to the mountains of Southern California, and that they only live 15 minutes away from the mountains because they've never lived in that culture. They live in the urban community, and the mountains are what you see in the distance. It's not a place where there's squirrels and there's birds and there's bugs and all the things that are up there. And so what we're doing with those kids is we're getting them out of their culture into a culture where they can learn something new and we can relate to them for 4 or 5 days. Well, when I started thinking of the impact of giving, well, I'm very generous with the quote budget needs of the church. I always want to sponsor at least one kid a year to go to camp for a week. Now,
Mhm.
that's because of my motivation for helping that kid experience creation, experience relationships, experience God in a new way. So even though you may not explain it on to me, I've got an expectation of what's going to happen to this kid when he goes. And so if you're not clear on helping a congregant understand what their resources are going to do, and if they don't know what the mission is, and they perceive it only as paying a person's salary, or people's salaries, then we're really losing the battle, because the responsibility is on the one that leads the nonprofit, in this case, the church, to really have a clarity of what the mission is. People will support the mission if they really are engaged in it. So, it's relationship, but it's also the responsibility of the church or the nonprofit to be really clear in what they're doing. Years in my experience in working with many nonprofits, one of the greatest challenges I run into is helping the organization articulate the mission needs of the organization with clarity on 2 pages of paper. And I find that they can verbalize a lot of things, but when it comes to putting it on paper, that's too much work. And yet most people really want to see that you've done your homework. They rarely are going to respond just to the emotional need. Although I know one guy that gave $48 million over 5 or 6 years. He said, "I always want to think I'm doing it with my intelligence, but ultimately I do it because I'm emotionally connected."
Yeah, yeah.
And they want to see the plan. You've got to give them the plan.
Right,
The
absolutely.
steward has got to make it. I think too often we think as people are like ATM machines. If we just say the right words, they'll spit money out. No, there are stewards that have been entrusted to manage what they've got carefully, and they will ask the hard questions.
Right.
And
So in your book, you also talk about, I think it's important that you mention that you encourage donors to do their research on organizations in which they're giving to. And I usually tell people if they ask the question is to look at the annual report. They should have a copy of it on their website or whatever. And also, you can look at tax returns. Do you have any other suggestions about researching organizations to see where the money is going?
Today, in our culture, in our American culture, we have some tools that are available to us. For instance, if you're looking into the Christian nonprofit world, there's a group called ECFA, Evangelical Accountability, and they are their own watchdog giving you details about the organizations that ascribe to the membership of ECFA. And and I would say, people, if you're being a good steward and they're not listed there, you want to know why they aren't listed there. That doesn't mean that they're bad, but there's got to be some good reason if you're avoiding being accountable to the very people that give to you. The 1099 forms, that's a
Mm,
form that the federal government requires of anybody that's not a church. So 1099s are available and you can go on their public record. The downside of that is they're usually a year or two old. It's what's available on the websites, because the most current website, in other words, of people that are filing 1099s for 2025, it may be 2024s that are up there right now before they release the 2025s through that process. But I think we've got to be helping the people be good at in doing their own investigation. Now, it'd be interesting to maybe say your our listeners don't realize that churches, by definition, do not file those kind of records. So then you've got to work harder to find out the information. So yes, you've got to do your homework. You've got to ask questions. I think you can test the process. In fact, I find most people that are highly generous and give a lot of money did not start giving a lot of money. They started with very small gifts to see what the organization would do with it.
mhm.
And I mentioned there was a friend of mine gave very significant millions of dollars over a period of 5 to 8 years. But he started off by helping one missionary at $50 a month. And it was 5 years later that he tipped his hat and wrote a check for $100,000 out of his personal checkbook. Well, that was the beginning of a journey of millions of dollars. The word development means we're going through a process of learning, and the process is steps and stages in growth and advancement. Last fall, I went to a fundraising dinner for a group that works in Africa, and I've been nothing but impressed with the way they followed up with me as a result of just giving $30 a month. Because I'm thinking, this is phenomenal. They're treating me well, and I'm inclined to want to know more because of the way they treated my first entry into that organization. If they had been sloppy at doing that and not done a good job, I'd probably say, well, I could put my priority someplace else and move on. But development in its definition is steps and stages in growth and advancement. And we've got to let everybody grow up. We got to have
Right,
people get ready to give greater amounts. On a typical church or a typical organization, I said, who has already given to you? And you probably got the wealth that you need for your future growth already writing checks to you. You just don't know who they are yet. And they are
right.
not going to be usually noisy. They're going to be quiet and reserved people. And you're not going to know they have that kind of capacity until they're ready to tip their hat.
Right. Another way besides the actual data that you can look up, and that is, are they good stewards in terms of developing a culture of transparency? So if they're hiding one thing, they might be hiding something else. So when it comes to money, usually what I find with the organizations that I've worked with over the years, and that is it is the organizational culture to be transparent in everything that they do besides just managing the money and the donations that they receive.
Yeah, I think what we don't realize that people talk to people, stewards talk to stewards. And if there is not transparency, the stewards are going to be talking about the lack of transparency. It may not come back to the organization very fast, but I will guarantee you bad news travels really quickly. And it's amazing how people that give to a cause end up liking to talk about what they're giving to. And they find out that you're giving to XYZ, they start comparing notes and they start talking about their experience. And that's going to make or break you ultimately because of the reputation that you create. So you got to keep in mind that all the time, you're not just talking to people that you're trying to swindle a lot of money. You're talking to people that have a sense of responsibility to use that money wisely.
Absolutely, especially those who are giving large gifts.
But the larger the gifts, but even they're looking to say, "How do I start that process, and how am I treated?"
So let me ask you this question. Tithing has become very controversial in Christian circles, especially today. I read your book and I know what your opinion is. Can you share with our audience what your position is on this practice?
Well, tithing it's a construed way of manipulation through many churches today. They feel like if they can get people up to the tithe, they've arrived. And they're looking for people that don't give much of anything. And then they say, if I can just get them to tithe, then we arrived at the right place. The tithing in the Old Testament, and that's where it all comes from, is the word tithe. It means 10. But if you study the Old Testament law and the way they tithe, they had to give 28% a year. And that had nothing to do with their offerings. The offerings were the free will gifts that came from the people. Tithing was basically the income tax of the Israelites that they had to give to the theocracy. And so when they were giving, they had to give it. They were giving actual products in this case. They weren't giving money like we give today. They had to bring their gifts twice a year in, and the third year they had to bring in a third tithe. And it was a requirement of the law, and the money was redistributed by the group called the Levites. It was a federal income tax, basically. It was interesting when Jesus starts talking about it. He was first watching a lady come in and give 2 mites. I mean, they were such small coins that you would think, okay, that's a waste of money. We could throw that over in the street. But he commented that she was the most generous of everybody because she gave all she had. And, it's really the New Testament introduces to whom much is given, much is also required. And so if you have been blessed in any way, and in the United States, we're all blessed regardless of our income compared to what the world is. So if to whom much is given, much is required, I'm recognizing that I am a steward of something that was given to me. And now I need to be good at doing that. And so it's no longer a matter of the tithe, which I use it in my own planning and budgeting. I know what my commitment is, but I'm not reaching to reach there. I'm saying that's where I start giving. It's interesting in my life experience, almost every year when I do my income tax, they ask me, well, you're going to be flagged because you give too much. Because I started at 10, I'm not stopping there. I just wanted that to be the basis where I start. So I think sometimes, unfortunately, the church today is teaching a very skewed, unbiblical way of teaching what tithing is. And tithing is not about an obligation. To whom much is given, much is also required. And that was the offering side of the Old Testament, was after you've given your tithe, what are you giving for your offerings? That was free will. That's what we have today in our culture, is free will.
Hmm.
There's only one major Christian group that actually invoices people against their budget. And I won't mention the name who it is, but there is a group out there today that says they sit down with their members, define how much their income is, and then they start invoicing you the tithe. Now that's a pretty unusual twist, but
Yes, it is.
but that is the way they collect it, and they believe they're collecting the tithe based on Old Testament teaching. I'm thinking, no, that's not that's manipulation. So I want people to realize you're free from the Old Testament style, but you're not free of using the principle of the tithe to be your standard of giving. And I would challenge you in that regard, at least be given 10%, not just
Hmm.
trying to get there, and at
Hmm.
least be generous in whatever you got, because you may be needing to give a lot more than what you think you're supposed to be giving. And that
Hmm.
is the nature of God's Spirit, is to say, let's just let it flow and be free with it. And the more it is true, the more you give, the more you have the capacity to give. So it's not a manipulation. I think there's a doctrine out there it's called the word of faith culture, but if I give to you, I'm going to be blessed. I'm going to have a bunch more. Now, God does say he's going to bless his kids, but it's not I don't give because I want to be self-served by God. I'm giving because he's just blessing me. And so when I'm free to do that, I'm not even sitting back thinking about a percentage. I'm thinking about, how can I use what I've been given to help meet the needs of somebody else? So the lid was blown off, and the New Testament teaching on giving is, to whom much is given, much is also required. Free it up and let it go. Yeah, and yes, if you want to use 10% as a place, but don't blame it on the Old Testament the way you got there, because if you're going to be accurate there, you better have 28% every single time you give out the door, because that's what the income tax was at that time.
So, my last question for you is, who is the book written for? And what is the biggest takeaway you want your audience to receive from reading your book?
Dr. Holmes, the book didn't start off as an author wanting to write a book. It,
Mm,
it started off as an assignment that I was given one day by when I was in the ministry I was working with. And there was quite an argument about the whole concept was we were in a process of raising significant money. The goal was to raise $1 billion for, evangelism and discipleship around the world. And the consultants that came into us said that can be done, but you need to start teaching people to be free in giving, lifestyle stewardship. If you don't teach that, you're going to create competition. Well, the organization wasn't ready to start another ministry of teaching giving. And there was a lot of discussion going on there. Now, I was a nobody in the room. I had some success and track record. I was leading a small team and we were making some really good progress. But I knew around the room I was the low man on the totem pole, and I didn't say hardly a word there. And in this discussion that was going on, somebody said, Larry's had some success in that. Let's assign Larry off to figure out what lifestyle stewardship is. Now, I later found out that I was assigned that task because they wanted to get off subject. And I wrote down on a yellow pad of paper, I can remember, what is lifestyle stewardship? And at the bottom of the page, Dr. Holmes, I wrote, and you've got the freedom to fail.
mm,
I had no clue what I was going to do. I had no idea what they were talking about. To me, historically, I was in the whole caught up on the tithe. This 10% goes to the church, that same routine. But when we got into that study, and I took 5 or 6 of my guys that were working with me, and I said, we need to figure this out. If we can figure this out, it might make a big difference in how we do life together. And we literally started a study of 4 or 5 months and came up with 5 key core principles behind lifestyle stewardship. And then we started training people. It changed everything we did. We started raising more resources. We were freed as couples to be a lot more intentional in what we were doing. So the book content of intentional living and giving came out of life experience, not out of, I want to write another book and what's the principles. Now, I wrote an earlier book in 1985 that was very parallel to the same concepts, but it was written for a generation back then. And I was in Ireland about 3 years ago, 4 years ago, and there was a group of about 6 or 8 people from around Europe. And they were commenting that it was really difficult to find biblically sound content to help other people understand giving in the European world. And I thought, it's time for me to dust off the concepts and get that back out there for the millennials and the Z generation. For the moms and dads that are living life to life, they're living paycheck to paycheck. Probably the design of the book is around anybody that's under 50, but although anybody older than that would appreciate it. And I divided that even at that time into 2 sections, because the thinking of the culture today is what's the essence and then what's the practicality. So the book's divided into 2 parts. What's the first 9 chapters? It's the biblical context of what lifestyle stewardship is. And then the remaining part of the book is, now that you've agreed that you want to be what I call an authorized wealth distributor, God's wealth and resources on demand, now here are some key principles of how you give, how you make decisions on giving, how you got to be careful of not being deceived, because in our culture today, deception is wicked out there, and there is a lot of bad deception being taught, even in the Christian context, about this subject. And I started to, at one time, I thought, well, I'll just list out everybody that's teaching it badly. And I thought, no, I want to give you principles so that you can listen to anybody, any pastor, any teacher, anybody on television or an author, and you can start to decide yourself with those principles if you think you're being deceived or not.
mm-hmm,
So it's not about a personality, it's about the principles of deception and how you as a steward can be smart enough to identify deception when you see it taking place. So I've gone through the book and saying, okay, here's the core principles, and then here's the application to it that you can use. And that's why I put it together. So it came out a couple of years ago, and I'm just trying to help a whole new generation understand very biblical concepts that help them live a life that helps them thrive. So that's the principles behind it. And it's the book's available. You can get it at Amazon. You can get it through Barnes& and Noble or Books A Million, wherever people wanna buy books, they can get it there. And then or they can go to my website, larryonan.com, and it's available there as well. But I just really wanna help people unlock confusion about this subject, and they're individually a steward is a leader responsible to take care of what he's been entrusted with.
Well, I so appreciate you and all the good information that you shared with us. And also, it's larryonan.com. Is that okay? So if people
Ariel
want to learn, if they want to learn more about you, if they want to purchase the book or they want to learn more about what you do, they could go there for that. It's been a real pleasure, Larry, and I appreciate you coming and sharing this information with our audience.
Well,
Thank you.
I pray that there's a lot of people getting greatly encouraged to go give themselves away today.
Amen. We'll end it there. Thank you.